suppose it's one of those experiences you never expect to happen to you. When I first noticed the little changes, I dismissed them. Looking back now, it's almost embarrassing how oblivious I was, just going through the motions, convinced everything was perfectly fine, or at least normal. Emily and I had been together for years, and like any couple, we had settled into a routine. I would work late, come home to a weary but familiar smile, and we'd drift off to sleep, side by side yet feeling worlds apart. Now, let me clarify, Emily is a good person, or at least I used to think so. But it turns out you can be a good person and still engage in awful behavior. I could sense she felt distant, unfulfilled. I guess the spark had dimmed a bit, but I assumed that was just part of marriage. We had a life together, a house, responsibilities. I never imagined she'd go searching for something, or someone else. Everything began at this cafe near her office. She started bringing it up, how she'd go there to unwind, grab a coffee, and escape from reality. She described the jazz music playing softly in the background, the cozy lighting, the aroma of coffee and fresh pastries. It was her little sanctuary, she said, a place where she could feel like herself again. I listened, but I didn't think much of it. I figured she was just trying to carve out some personal space. We all need that, don't we? Then she met him, Jake. Just hearing his name now makes my stomach churn. He was a young barista, probably in his early 20s, covered in tattoos with a cocky grin, the kind of guy who likely believed he was a gift to women. Apparently, he was just what Emily had been seeking. At first, it seemed innocent, or at least that's what she kept telling herself. I imagine she convinced herself he was just being kind, showering her with a little extra attention. A heart drawn in the foam of her coffee. A small note slipped into her hand. Have a great day, beautiful, or today is your day. She started to glow every time she visited that cafe, coming home with an expression I hadn't seen in years. That look had once been reserved for me. Initially, I didn't suspect a thing. Maybe I just didn't want to. But now, reflecting on it all, it's painfully clear how everything began to unravel, piece by piece. She started dressing up more. New outfits. A bit more makeup than usual. A perfume she hadn't worn in ages. It was subtle at first, so minor you could easily overlook it. But those small details accumulated, and soon it became impossible to ignore. I'd catch her on her phone, seemingly lost in her own world, and when I'd ask what she was doing, she'd simply say she was catching up with a friend. I believed her, until I couldn't anymore. Before long, this so-called innocent connection extended beyond the cafe. One evening, she returned home a bit tipsy, her cheeks flushed and eyes sparkling, smelling of a place we'd never visited together. She mentioned hanging out with some friends after work, something casual, she claimed. Yet, she couldn't meet my gaze when she said it. That's when the gut feeling started creeping in, that nagging sense that something was off. I didn't confront her then. I let it simmer beneath the surface. Weeks went by, and she kept going to that damn cafe, eagerly anticipating her mornings as if they were the best part of her day. They began having deep conversations, or so she described, about dreams and passions. Meanwhile, I was at home, making sure everything ran smoothly, convinced it was just a phase she would outgrow. She was finding herself, she said. And what could I say to that? It was as if she transformed into a different person whenever she recounted these little chats they shared. He wasn't just some barista anymore. He was this guy with passion, with dreams, filling her mind with who knows what about living in the moment and finding happiness. Suddenly, her life with me felt like a prison. She'd accidentally brush her hand against his when he handed her coffee, and I'm sure she reassured herself it was just friendly, just two people connecting. But those looks she gave him, she never looked at me like that anymore. There I was, left wondering if this was just how marriages functioned, convincing myself everything was still normal. Then came the real blow. He asked her out, although he probably didn't label it as a date. It was just a concert, something fun to share with someone interesting, he told her. And she bought it. Or maybe she simply wanted to believe it was innocent. She told me she was going to a concert with friends from work, something casual. I believed her. God, I was such a fool. The thought that she'd go out with this guy never even crossed my mind. She was my wife, after all. Apparently, they had an unforgettable night. She later mentioned it casually. "Oh, we had a great time. And then we went to this cute restaurant afterward. Nothing fancy." But what she failed to mention was that it wasn't just friends. She probably told herself it was innocent fun, or that she was just letting loose, escaping the monotony. But the way she came home that night, radiating a glow, laughing in a way that wasn't meant for me, that's when I realized things were worse than I ever imagined. The next part, I only discovered later, but it's etched in my memory now as if I witnessed it firsthand. After their not-a-date, they strolled back to his place. She told me later how it all unfolded, how he gazed at her like she was some kind of goddess, how he leaned in slowly, offering her the choice to back away. She didn't want to, and when he kissed her, that was it. She crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. They ended up at his place, where she felt alive again, free, young. She was living out some teenage fantasy, an idea of what life could have been had she made different choices. But she had made her choices, hadn't she? And one of those choices was me. That's what hurts the most. If I had to pinpoint when things truly began to feel different, I'd say it was right after that night she went to the concert. It was as if a switch had been flipped. She wasn't the same person coming home. Not really. And maybe it sounds dramatic, but I could feel it in the way she looked at me, as though I had become just another piece of furniture. The way she laughed when her phone buzzed, or how her face brightened with some inside joke I wasn't part of. I noticed these things. At first, I told myself I was imagining it, but it became too glaringly obvious to ignore. One of the first things that struck me was how suddenly Emily seemed to care about her appearance. Don't get me wrong. She's always been beautiful, but she was never one to spend hours primping in front of the mirror. Now, though, she was putting a lot more effort into her outfits, makeup, and even perfume. Fragrance she hadn't touched in years. I remember that scent. It was the same one she wore when we first started dating. I used to adore it. Now, every time I caught a whiff, it only reminded me of how everything was slipping through my fingers. At first, I kept quiet. I didn't want to come across as a paranoid husband, overanalyzing everything. But she continued to pull away. It felt like an invisible wall had risen between us, one I didn't even know how to begin dismantling. When she was home, her mind was somewhere else entirely. She would spend hours absorbed in her phone, her face illuminated by the screen's glow. Whenever I asked what she was doing, her responses were vague. Just chatting with a friend, or scrolling through some stuff. It didn't sit right with me, but I kept telling myself to let it go. Maybe she was just stressed or going through something she didn't know how to share. I tried to respect the space she seemed to crave, even though every instinct screamed that something was seriously off. Then the nights out began. She would leave in the evenings, looking glamorous, telling me she needed time to recharge. I'd sit there, watching her prepare, wondering who she was dressing up for because it definitely wasn't me. When I inquired about her plans, she'd become defensive, insisting she just needed some time alone. Alone? She'd never needed that before. Each time I tried to dig deeper, she'd roll her eyes, acting as if I was smothering her. It was around this time I started noticing how often she would sit there, grinning at her phone. She'd be typing away, completely oblivious to my presence. I'd attempt to strike up a conversation, but she'd brush me off or look up with this distracted expression, as if I was interrupting something critical. And occasionally, I'd catch a flicker of guilt on her face, but she would quickly mask it with excuses, pretending nothing was amiss. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to convince myself that this was just a strange phase she was going through. Yet that uneasy feeling gnawed at me. I remember thinking that if I just ignored it, maybe it would fade away, that if I pretended hard enough, everything would revert to how it once was. But I couldn't shake the sense that I was losing her. The thought of her seeing someone else felt too immense, too terrible to even entertain. So I did what any guy in my position would do. I reached out to my best friend, Chris. We've known each other since high school, and he's been through enough with me to recognize when something's off. I didn't even want to share the whole story at first. It felt too humiliating. But when I finally laid it all out, he didn't laugh or dismiss it. He simply listened, nodding, asking a few thoughtful questions. Then he said something that stuck with me. "If it feels wrong, Tom, it probably is. Don't ignore your gut, man. Just be cautious." Hearing him say that hit me hard. For so long, I had convinced myself I was just being paranoid, that I was misinterpreting things that weren't even there. But Chris planted a seed in my mind, the idea that maybe I wasn't losing my mind after all. He didn't suggest I go through her phone or follow her. He just told me to keep my eyes open and to be aware. Then came the credit card charges. I know it sounds cliché, like something out of a bad movie, but that's what finally pushed me over the edge. One night, while she was in the shower, I found myself poring over our statements. I can't explain why I did it. Perhaps it was that increasing sense of dread, or maybe I just craved a sense of control. But there they were, charges from upscale restaurants and bars I hadn't even visited. Places I'd never heard her mention. Expensive places. And I knew right then and there she wasn't going to those places alone. I still remember the feeling of despair as I sat there, my stomach churning, desperately trying to concoct a reasonable explanation. Maybe she was going out with friends? Perhaps it was a work-related outing? But deep down, I couldn't shake the conviction that these were date spots, the kind you go to with someone special. And it wasn't me. I hadn't taken her out anywhere like that in ages. When she finally emerged from the shower that night, I couldn't bring myself to meet her gaze. She stood there, talking about something trivial, but all I could think about were those charges and what they implied. I felt like a stranger in my own home, sitting across from a woman I thought I knew, questioning who she truly was. That night, lying next to her, sleep eluded me. I stared at the ceiling, contemplating my next move. I wanted to confront her, to demand the truth, but part of me wasn't ready to hear it. I kept going back and forth in my mind, trying to devise some excuse, some reason that didn't involve her sneaking around behind my back. But the evidence was piling up, piece by painful piece. I'd catch her staring off into space, that little smile creeping onto her face, and I knew, whatever she was thinking about, it wasn't me. Each time her phone buzzed, she'd flinch, quickly glancing at it before tucking it away as if hiding some precious secret. The hardest part was the silence. She began going out more frequently, leaving me alone in that empty house, trying to distract myself from the thoughts I didn't want to confront. When she was home, our conversations were barely there. Felt like she was just existing next to me, not truly with me. I could sense myself slipping, sinking into a pit of doubt and suspicion, and I loathed it. I hated what it was turning me into, but I couldn't stop myself from heading down that path. The strange thing is, we never experienced any massive blowouts, no shouting matches or anything like that. Maybe that's what made the situation even harder to bear. It was this gradual, silent transformation. A chilling distance that crept in like fog, suffocating every aspect of our lives until I hardly recognized either her or myself anymore. Deep down, I had an unsettling sense that whatever was happening was only the beginning of something far worse. If anyone might have had insight into what was truly happening with Emily, it would be her best friend, Megan. They had been inseparable since their college days, and Megan had a knack for reading people like a book. So, when Emily began to change, it didn't take long for Megan to pick up on it. One night, she stopped by to drop off something for Emily, and since we were alone, we ended up chatting. Megan casually mentioned how Emily had been acting distant, how she frequently canceled their plans, claiming she was too busy. Megan then asked if I had noticed any shifts in Emily's behavior, but I brushed it off. I didn't know how to explain the truth. Admitting that my marriage was starting to feel like a mirage, that I could feel her slipping away and had no idea how to stop it. I stammered something about work stress and tried to divert the conversation, but Megan didn't look convinced. Apparently, she had also confronted Emily. Megan had been direct, asking her about the cafe and her new friend. From what I gathered, Emily just laughed it off, saying Jake was simply the guy who made her coffee, nothing more. Megan pressed her a bit, cautioning that she needed to be careful, that she might be getting too emotionally involved. I wish I could have eavesdropped on that conversation, watching as Emily dodged the probing questions. Megan told me that Emily dismissed it all as no big deal, claiming she was just having fun after feeling stifled at home. "It's innocent," she told Megan. "Just a little entertainment." But Megan wasn't convinced, and now neither was I. The issue was that Megan couldn't do much more than hint at her suspicions. She wasn't going to push Emily too hard, and while she was worried, she couldn't really intervene. As for Emily, she certainly wasn't going to take advice from anyone, especially not if it meant letting go of the excitement she was experiencing with this guy. Around the same time, another player entered the scene, David. They had known each other ages ago, and suddenly he was back in her life. Maybe they crossed paths by chance, or perhaps she reached out to him. I really had no clue. All I knew was that he became her friendly lunch buddy, someone she'd meet during the week. She didn't hide it much. She'd casually mention going to lunch with David, always emphasizing that he was just an old friend. The way she talked about him seemed innocent enough. But every time she returned from one of those lunches, she looked a little lighter, a little more vibrant. I didn't suspect anything romantic between them, but I could tell she enjoyed the attention. Maybe she craved someone to listen, someone who wasn't me. Meanwhile, I was at home, trying to piece together all these little things that didn't quite add up. Then she would head out for lunch with David, confiding in him about who knows what, allowing him to fill some emotional void that I had apparently failed to fill. Of course, she kept her involvement with Jake a secret. That was a part of her life she buried deep down, treating it like a hidden treasure. David was the one she could share her frustrations with, the one who would nod along and probably tell her she deserved better, that she was too good to feel trapped. But Jake, he was something different altogether. He was the one who made her feel alive, who provided the thrill she had convinced herself was necessary. Meanwhile, I started feeling like a complete stranger in my own marriage. Whenever I attempted to talk to her, it was like I was running into a brick wall. She would respond with short, curt answers, her gaze drifting off as if she were lost in another world. When I tried to dig deeper, asking her what was really going on, she'd become defensive, insisting that she needed space. Space from what? From me? From the life we had built together? At that moment, I was so twisted up inside that I didn't know which way was up. Every instinct told me something was wrong, but a part of me fought to push it down, trying to convince myself I was being overly dramatic. Who wants to face the truth that their marriage is on shaky ground? That the woman I thought I would grow old with was slowly drifting away? I needed someone to confide in, someone who would truly understand. So I called Chris. He had been my best friend for as long as I could remember, the kind of guy who always told it to me straight. When I opened up about Emily's behavior, he listened without interrupting, allowing me to vent completely. Once I finished, he let out a long sigh and said, "Tom, man, you can't ignore this. You know something's wrong. Don't let her make a fool of you." It was as if he could see the signs before I could. He didn't say it outright, but it was clear that I needed to wake up and face the reality of the situation. "Look," he said, "I know you don't want to think about it, but if she's hiding things, you need to pay attention. Just keep your eyes open." That conversation lingered in my mind. For the first time, I allowed myself to acknowledge that maybe I wasn't just being paranoid. Maybe something significant was happening. Once that thought took root, there was no going back. Every little detail began to feel like evidence. Every text she received, every smile she flashed at her phone, every late night, catching up with friends. I started connecting the dots, like a grim puzzle where betrayal was the only possible conclusion. I'd catch her grinning at her phone, that glimmer in her eyes that had been absent for so long, and with each glimpse, it felt like a fresh wound. She wasn't thinking of me when she smiled like that. She was thinking of him, or perhaps both of them. It reached a point where I felt like I was losing my grip on reality, where every minor detail felt like another fissure in our relationship. I couldn't even enjoy a peaceful evening at home without a creeping sense of anxiety, a feeling that everything was on the brink of collapse. And through it all, she kept visiting that cafe, continued meeting up with David, and drifted further away from me. The irony was that I didn't have solid proof, at least not yet. But my instincts were screaming at me, warning me that if I didn't confront the situation, if I didn't take action, I would lose her entirely. Still, I was terrified of what I might uncover if I delved too deeply, afraid that once I opened that door, there would be no closing it again. So, I kept waiting, clinging to the hope that this was all in my imagination. Maybe she would return to me, that the woman I fell in love with was still there, buried beneath whatever was drawing her away. But deep down, I understood that things could never return to how they once were. And Chris, he kept insisting that I stay sharp, not to ignore my instincts. Trust your gut, Tom. Don't let her manipulate you. The truth was, I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to consider the possibility that she could betray me like this. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was already too late. It felt as though whatever we had was slipping through my fingers, and I was just a bystander, helplessly watching it all fall apart. I don't know what finally pushed me to the brink that day. Maybe it was the months of ignoring the signs, the relentless late nights, the secret smiles, and the quiet way she seemed to pull away from me with every passing week. Or maybe it was Chris, planting that final seed of doubt the night before. He had looked me in the eye and said, "You deserve to know, Tom. You can't keep living like this." And deep down, I knew he was right. So that morning, I made my decision. I would go to the cafe where she spent so much time. I'd blend into the background, unnoticed, and see for myself if there was any truth to the nagging suspicions that haunted me. I called Chris, needing someone there with me, someone to stop me if I lost control, someone to pull me back if things escalated. Without hesitation, he replied, "I'll be there. Let's do this." On the way to the cafe, my mind was a chaotic mess. I couldn't concentrate, couldn't even form coherent thoughts. Part of me hoped I'd be mistaken, that this was all just my paranoia, that I'd find her there, sitting alone with a book, or perhaps chatting with a friend. But deep down, I knew better. I had ignored my instincts for too long, told myself I was being irrational. But as I stood outside that cafe, I could no longer deceive myself. I had to know the truth. When we stepped inside, the cafe was bustling with the morning crowd. The gentle hum of jazz floated through the air, mingling with the enticing aroma of coffee and fresh pastries. It was almost soothing, almost enough to convince me that maybe this was a big misunderstanding. But then I saw them. Emily and Jake, nestled at a table near the window, laughing together as if nothing else mattered. She had her back to me, but I recognized that laugh, that tilt of her head, the way she leaned in, hanging on his every word. My chest constricted, my pulse quickening. I watched as she placed her hand on his knee, her fingers lingering just a moment too long. Jake, with that arrogant grin plastered on his face, looked at her like she was the only person in the universe. They shared an intimate glance, charged and electric, that made my stomach lurch. I felt nauseous, the urge to yell, to scream, to explode in that moment overwhelming me. But I was frozen in place, witnessing my marriage unravel before my eyes. Chris must have noticed the shock on my face because he gently placed a hand on my shoulder, steering me back toward the door. "Come on, man," he murmured. "Let's get out of here. There are better ways to handle this." I couldn't even muster a response. I let him guide me outside, my mind reeling, my heart racing in my chest. The image of them together was seared into my memory, her ridiculous smile, her hand on his knee, as if I didn't exist, like I had never existed. It felt like my entire life had been yanked out from under me, as if everything I had believed, everything I had trusted, was a complete fabrication. As we walked down the street, I could feel the fury building within me, a scorching rage that had been buried for far too long. For months, I had ignored the signs, convinced myself it was just a rough patch, that if I tried hard enough, we could fix it. Meanwhile, she was inside, laughing with this kid as if nothing mattered. I clenched my fists, the anger surging through me, my vision blurring as I tried to process it all. Chris was saying something, offering advice about not letting her get to me, about handling things calmly, but his words barely registered. All I could think about was the expression on her face, that smile, that tender look she had given him, something she hadn't shared with me in years. "You don't have to do anything hasty, Tom," Chris said, his voice calm yet firm. "I know you're in pain, but this isn't how to end things." There are better paths to take. I recognized the truth in his words. I knew that storming back in there and creating a scene wouldn't change anything. It wouldn't undo the betrayal, nor would it erase the months of deception. But knowing that didn't make it any easier. Every part of me ached to march back in there, to confront her, to force her to acknowledge the hurt she had caused. Yet deep down, I understood that such an outburst wouldn't fix anything. If anything, it would only provide her with more reasons to resent me, more justifications for her actions. So I inhaled deeply, letting the anger simmer just beneath the surface, transforming it into something more powerful. Resolve. I wasn't going to be the fool any longer. I refused to let her mock our marriage, the life we had built together. If she wanted out, so be it. But I was determined to ensure she regretted every moment spent with that arrogant little punk. Chris must have sensed the change in my demeanor because he nodded, his face reflecting quiet understanding. "You know where to find me if you need anything," he said, giving my shoulder a reassuring pat. "But don't do anything reckless, okay? She's not worth it." I watched him walk away, his words echoing in my mind. She's not worth it. Maybe he was right. Maybe the woman I had married, the one I had loved, was already gone, replaced by someone I no longer recognized. Someone who could laugh with another man while I stood by, watching my world crumble. Yet, there remained a part of me, a stubborn, foolish part, that clung to hope, that held on to the idea that she might come to her senses, realize her mistakes, and return to me. But as I stood there, replaying that scene over and over in my mind, I understood that things had gone too far. There was no way to turn back, no fixing what had been broken. The damage was irreversible. And perhaps, just perhaps, it was time to start considering my own needs, to think about what I wanted and how I would move forward. As I walked away from that cafe, that gnawing sense of betrayal burning in my chest, one thought reverberated in my mind, again and again: revenge. After the cafe, I was finished with self-pity. I had spent months in a spiral of worry, pretending that everything was okay. I had let Emily twist me up inside, watching as she flirted and laughed with someone else right in front of me. So that night, I resolved to change things. I refused to be the guy who sat idly by, waiting for some miraculous resolution. I wanted payback. Maybe it was petty, maybe it wouldn't solve anything, but I needed something to remind me that I was still alive, that I hadn't been completely hollowed out by her betrayal. Chris, being the solid friend he is, didn't even question my call. "Let's go out," I said, and without missing a beat, he agreed. We headed to one of the popular clubs downtown, the kind of place we used to frequent when we were younger, before life got complicated. I hadn't stepped foot in a venue like that in years, and as we entered, the pulsing music and flashing lights enveloped me. The crowded dance floor alive with energy. It all felt surreal. But for the first time in what felt like forever, I experienced a sense of freedom. Chris and I grabbed a couple of drinks, allowing the alcohol to begin working its magic. I could feel the tension dissolving, as if each sip washed away a bit of the anger and bitterness I had been carrying. I lost myself in the crowd, in the thumping bass, in the electric atmosphere of the club. It was just what I needed, a break from the reality that had suffocated me for so long. Then, out of the blue, I spotted her. Rachel, my ex from long ago, the one I had always thought of as the one that got away. She looked stunning, perhaps even more beautiful now, radiating the confidence that comes with a few more years of life. She noticed me first, a sly smile creeping across her face as she sauntered over, taking me in as if she were appraising me. Suddenly, it felt like the years between us had evaporated. "Tom," she said, her voice smooth and inviting. "Didn't expect to see you here." There was a spark in her eyes, a mixture of recognition and curiosity, and maybe, just maybe, a hint of something more. Our conversation flowed effortlessly, the kind that happens when you've known someone well enough to skip the awkward small talk. She was confident and flirtatious, making subtle comments that hinted she hadn't forgotten about our past or the connection we had shared. I couldn't deny that I was enjoying it. Here was someone who actually saw me, who wanted my attention, who wasn't looking through me as if I were invisible. Chris, ever the supportive wingman, stepped back, allowing Rachel and me to reconnect. As we danced, her body leaned in close, laughter spilling from her lips as she responded to my silly jokes. I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, desired, needed even. I didn't pull away when she brushed her hand against my arm or when her fingers lingered just a bit too long on my shoulder. I let her play her game and I played right along, thinking that maybe, just maybe, this was precisely what I needed. Then, as if fate had orchestrated the night, two other women joined us, Katie and Sophia. They were younger, exuding that carefree vibe that comes with a night out for pure fun. No strings attached. They were drawn to our little group, with Katie clearly taking a liking to Chris, while Sophia focused her attention on me. There was something in the way they looked at us, especially at me. A mix of curiosity and a hint of danger. It was as if they could sense the raw energy emanating from me, the intensity of a man who had been wronged and was ready to forget it all, even if just for one night. Rachel didn't shy away either. If anything, she seemed to revel in the attention I was receiving, slipping her arm around my waist as if to stake her claim. She leaned in, whispering something teasing in my ear that sent my head spinning, and in that moment, I didn't care about anything except what was happening right then and there. Laughter filled the air, drinks flowed freely, the music pulsed around us, and I felt like I had escaped the chaos that was my marriage. At some point, though I couldn't tell you how, we ended up back at my place. Perhaps it was the drinks or just the electric energy of the night, but none of us were ready to call it a night. The girls laughed while Chris poured more drinks, and the atmosphere was thick with a spark I hadn't felt in years. A sense of liberation. Katie and Sophia took turns flirting with me, leaving playful lipstick marks on my cheeks, tugging at my shirt, leaning in closer than necessary. Rachel observed with an amused smirk, clearly enjoying the attention I was getting, as if she were in on the game. She whispered little jokes in my ear, things that made me chuckle, things that allowed me to forget everything else. For the first time in a long while, I let myself be free. I surrendered to the night, became the center of attention, allowed myself to be desired. I knew it was reckless, perhaps even foolish, but I didn't care. All I wanted was to drown out the pain, to forget about Emily, about Jake, about the web of lies and betrayal. In that moment, with Rachel's hand in mine and Katie and Sophia laughing beside me, I finally felt liberated. The hours blurred together, a whirlwind of laughter, flirtation, and the kind of wild energy that only arises when you have nothing left to lose. We drank, danced around my living room, and laughed as if we were free from every concern. It was messy, chaotic, and precisely what I needed. At one point, Katie leaned in, leaving a bold red lipstick mark on my neck, a silent testament to the wild night we were having. I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror, disheveled, wild-eyed, and for once, I didn't see the beaten-down man I had become. I saw someone new, someone who no longer cared, who was ready to move on and reclaim a piece of himself. When the night finally began to wind down, we sprawled across my living room, the aftermath of the party scattered around us. Empty bottles, lipstick-stained glasses, and the lingering scent of perfume in the air. I looked around at the people surrounding me, at the smiles, at the contentment, and I felt something I hadn't experienced in a long time. A sense of satisfaction, a sense of closure, as if I had finally reclaimed a part of myself. The next morning, I was sprawled out on the couch, still half asleep, when I heard the front door click open. I instantly recognized who it was, but I didn't move. I just lay there, letting the moment build, listening to her footsteps approach. Emily walked into the living room, and the shock on her face was priceless. Pillows were strewn about, empty bottles littered the floor, and the faint scent of perfume still hung in the air. Rachel, still half asleep, was curled up beside me, while across the room, Katie and Sophia were wrapped up in blankets, dozing peacefully. It was a scene of pure chaos, one I hadn't intended for her to see, but I couldn't have scripted it better if I'd tried. Her expression shifted from shock to something deeper. Anger, hurt. She stared at me, her mouth moving as if she were trying to find the right words. But what could she possibly say? For months, she had been drifting away, piece by piece, finding solace in someone else's arms. And now, here she was witnessing me do the same. Finally, she managed to stammer, What is this?" I sat up slowly, feeling a sense of calm wash over me that I hadn't experienced in a long time. I met her gaze directly and, with a small, satisfied smile, replied, "Now you know what it feels like to be betrayed." My words hung in the air, slicing through any defenses she might have had. I could see the realization dawn on her face, mingled with regret and maybe even a hint of guilt. She took a step back, her eyes wide, as if she were finally grasping the chaos she had created, the destruction she had left in her wake. For the first time, it wasn't me standing there with the shattered pieces. It was her. Emily didn't utter another word. She just stood there, absorbing it all, her face pale and her hands trembling. Then, without another glance, she turned and walked out, slamming the door behind her. The sound reverberated through the empty house, marking the end of something that had been dead long before I'd recognized it. Once she left, a strange sense of relief washed over me. I understood she wouldn't be coming back. Not truly. That morning I had regained control. I was no longer the guy sitting idly by, watching his marriage crumble. I had finally taken a stand for myself, doing something that reminded me I was still here, that I still mattered. News traveled fast after that. I heard through the grapevine that Jake had begun to distance himself from her, likely trying to avoid the aftermath. Whatever they had quickly fizzled out. The fantasy had shattered, and Jake wasn't interested in the chaos that came with it. As for David, from what I could gather, he had caught wind of her affair with Jake. The judgment must have been too much, and he quietly withdrew from her life. One by one, the people she had relied on for validation and attention vanished, leaving her alone to pick up the pieces. As for me, I didn't waste any time. I filed for divorce that same week, making it clear that reconciliation was off the table. Chris and Rachel stood by me every step of the way. Rachel, in particular, I don't know how she did it, but she seemed to grasp exactly what I needed. She didn't push, didn't attempt to complicate things with a relationship. She simply showed up. She was a constant presence, steady and calm, a reminder that life didn't end because of one betrayal. After the divorce was finalized, Rachel and I discussed the possibility of taking a trip together, somewhere far away, where I could leave all of this behind and start anew. It wasn't about romance, not yet. It was about carving out a new path, building a life that didn't revolve around the ruins of my marriage. I took one last look at the house before leaving, locking the door on a chapter that had been filled with pain but also growth. The man who walked away that day wasn't the same desperate soul who had tried to cling to a failing relationship, ignoring every sign and instinct, hoping that love would somehow be enough to mend it. I was transformed, someone stronger, someone who understood his worth. And Emily? I don't know where she is or what she's doing. All I know is that she's alone, facing the consequences of her choices. In the end, maybe that's the best revenge of all.